them online as opposed to the traditional hard copy, it's not going to be an exact replica, and we're going to chat about why and the distinctions. So the value of our print publication is, even though most things, many things, we know that virtually everything is being driven now with an electronic component, with a social media component, a interactive aspect of it, right? And we like that. We like the way that we can have a two-way reciprocal relationship with our stakeholders at the organization, that we allow them to comment, that if they want more information, they can click on a hyperlink that we embedded. So in a lot of ways, it enhances our control over the additional information that our stakeholders are reading. But print publications are still alive and well, even in the age of cyberspace. And at first, we might kind of raise an eyebrow and question that, but I want you to think about the number of individuals who have jobs that aren't tied to computers, right? And for us in public relations or professional communication, sometimes this can be hard to remember because we're either tied to, at the very least, a smartphone, checking in with our social media, or doing a lot of work at our desks in terms of creating press releases and other types of tactics. But think about large chains, think about Target or Walgreens, for example. How many employees aren't on a computer most of the day, right? How they are then receiving the information from their organization through a print channel, right? Typically a newsletter. I also want you to think about a number of professional jobs. So think about physicians or think about nurses or other healthcare professionals who are on their feet walking around servicing patients all day. Right, the way that organizations are reaching them then are through newsletters that are available in the break room and other shared professional spaces. So the nice thing about a print publication is it's portable, right? We don't need to make sure that we have access to an internet or intranet. We can take it home and read it. We can take it and display it in ways that are easier for our entire staff or group to read it. It's portable, right? The other thing is it gives the real feel of the organization. So we know that we try really hard when we're creating an electronic newsletter or through our social media, any type of mediated channel to portray our organization's look and feel. And sometimes it's a little bit easier on paper. And the other thing that is nice too is based on the device someone is using to view your electronic newsletter, for example, can be a very different experience. Colors can be slightly different. We know that many people have cracked screens, so that can change the experience. Also, depending on the width of the screen and the defaults that people have on tablets, computers, their phones, it's going to change that reading experience. But when we print off a newsletter or brochure, we control the look and feel, the spacing, the coloring, right? The other thing that's nice is our print publication should be created in a way that are a springboard to drive our stakeholders to our website. Right? So if we're doing this correctly and we're doing this strategically and thoughtfully, we are going to use this to generate additional electronic traffic. What the challenge becomes then is what goes into these print publications. Right? So figuring out too, how do we engage our audience? How do we provide them information that they're going to want to read, right? And that they will dedicate their time to reading, to looking at. So if you think of busy professionals, whether it's an individual who's doing a 10-hour shift at Target, or a nurse or a physician, all of whom are on their feet all day, what is it about our publication that when they get to take that small break during the day, that it's going to drive them to actually give us their attention, to tune in and see what the organization is doing? So we can see that this becomes our challenge in terms of creating a print publication that is intriguing, informative, and still represents the strategic needs and goals of the organization. So one thing that I would recommend, that our textbook authors recommend, is making sure that, especially for your newsletters, that you have a purposeful mission statement. And the reason you do that is to make sure that what ends up being a way in which to decide what information is included and what information is excluded. I included an example here. This is from St. Jude. So their mission statement for a magazine that they produce says, the magazine serves as the hospital's external platform to educate the public about the innovative research and excellent medical care happening at St. Jude. The publication tells who we are, a world-class biomedical research institution, as well as children's hospital that treats patients regardless of their family's ability to pay. Okay. So what this mission statement tells us is that, one, if I'm an employee, I'm not going to find information that is directed specifically to me, right? I'm not going to find information about my health plan changes, about events that are coming up in order to thank me as an employee, or anything else administrative. I might learn about some new research that my colleagues in a different area are doing, but I will remember that when I'm reading this, this is what my organization is communicating to external audiences, right? So this becomes interesting too. So many of you, we encourage you to do your homework before you go on job interviews, remembering too that when we're reading different promotional materials that are created by these organizations we're interviewing with, to remember who the audience is, what we can anticipate based on the audience, and what we can then interpret based on the information we're reading. Right? So remember, all of these things are done or should be done mindfully. Also, for you as a writer, either now or in the future, having that strong mission statement can really help you in the organization when you have strong personalities who are really wanting to abdicate to do one angle over another. If you have that concise, purposeful mission statement, then we can use that as a way to say, this doesn't quite align with the mission of this magazine, or to explain why we made certain choices. So we just did an example of St. Jude's. They publish an externally focused magazine. Kind of similar, we can also do newsletters. You know, this week you're going to be able to choose between doing a two-sided newsletter or a brochure, which will also be 6-panel, meaning that regardless if you select the newsletter or the brochure, it's going to be a one-sheet but double-sided promotional tactic for your client. What I want you to think about now, and as you transition into your professional lives, is remember that you have a number of audiences. And that was part of why we did the client research report right away, as a way to decide and to understand who my organization, who my client is in communication with. Right? Who do they need to interact with? Who is depending on them? So you might decide then, this newsletter is only for internal associates. Right? That newsletter is going to look very different than the example we just looked at on the previous slide with the St. Jude magazine that is externally focused. So considering our number of audiences, we might create several newsletters. Typically, what organizations have tended to do is one internal and typically one external, depending on who they are and what they do. I know when I was in the healthcare sector, We had an internal newsletter for associates. We had an external newsletter for potential and current patients. And then we also had another external newsletter, that a B2B, a business-to-business newsletter, where we positioned our orthopedic surgeons as experts and sent this newsletter out to other orthopedic surgeons in the area in order to show the cutting work that our surgeons were doing. Okay? So that resulted in 3 very frequent newsletters. So when we know we have that many audiences we're attempting to reach and that many publications we're attempting to create and to fill, it becomes important that we plan. So you may have heard of an editorial calendar before. I think I've mentioned it in earlier lectures. An editorial calendar typically is 1 year of planning. Some organizations, based on their budget, they might do this quarterly. I wouldn't suggest that because typically we're doing a quarterly newsletter. But I do 1 to 2 years of planning, or 1.5 years of planning. But it's where you're looking ahead and generally mapping out what the major focus of each newsletter or magazine issue will be. Right? So we're looking to say we're going to focus on in February, we're going to focus on heart health because it aligns with the American Hospital Association and what they do in Going Red for Women. And so you can use this as an opportunity to tie into holidays, to anything going on in the news, to any type of life cycle that makes sense for your organization. But this 1 year of planning gives us plenty of time to try and decide who do we need to interview, what pictures do we need to take, what other information do we need to gather, so that it becomes a lot easier, a lot more feasible for us, especially if we're maintaining more than one newsletter or magazine, to juggle all of these in a way that is manageable and still results in high quality publications. So what do you want to think about? Obviously, the first thing, and what we always do in public relations, is answering the question for readers, what's in it for me? Right? So why am I going to take my time to read this? Why am I going to take my time to engage in this information? What does this do to make my life better? How does it educate me? How does it entertain me? How does it keep me in the know? Then you want to think about, after you figure out who your audience is, we've probably, especially if this is a new newsletter or magazine or brochure, we want to do a focus group. We want to do some interviews with our stakeholders to ask the individuals we're attempting to reach, to ask them, why are you interested in this? What would you read? Right? What information are you looking to us to provide to you? So you want to do that. And then after we have a general idea of what topics we're going to focus on, then I want you to think about the design. So a newsletter that is directed to our employees is likely going to look different than the newsletter we send to existing and potential customers. Right? So both of them need to reflect the personality of the organization. But you're going to think about how the relationship you have with your employees is likely going to be a little bit less formal, a little bit more informal. We might stress different aspects of the organization's identity than when we do with external stakeholders. When I worked in the hospital setting, as I was transitioning out, we were going through this new internal branding where we talked about the personal connected journey. And this was this idea that every individual, and in this context, every employee, had their own journey. Right? So what was right for one employee was not necessarily the right path for another employee, but it was about valuing everyone's unique story, who they are, and who they are going to be. That was not language that we used with external stakeholders. Right? We had externally focused messaging. So in that sense, our internal newsletter The design was slightly different. The colors were slightly different. Obviously, we didn't have a different logo, but just the way in which we were attempting to cultivate the employee organization relationship differed greatly than the relationship between the organization and external stakeholders. So we want you to think about that. In terms of formatting, it is up to you in the organization, especially with print copies. We want to be mindful of cost. We know that newsletters are traditionally done in color. That can be costly, especially if we're looking at externally focused newsletters. A lot of times these end up looking, when they say mega paper, that's more similar to, think about when you open up a newspaper, think about USA Today or something along that notion. A lot of organizations will use that size of paper and that approach for external stakeholders. Whereas internally, we might do something more similar to what you're creating for the purposes of this class is an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, double-sided. Right? Magazine too, these tend to be fairly expensive to create and produce. So these aren't often produced as frequently as newsletters are. Because again, a lot of times they tend to be glossy paper, a thicker type of paper, which increases cost. In terms of your layout, again, our press release is so formulaic, right? We have a very, very clear template that we have to work within. But if we're thinking about newsletters and magazines, here we have a lot of room to be creative. And what you will want to take into account is, one, what is the look and feel of your organization? This is going to be a very, very different experience for you if you are coming into a new organization or if you're part of an organization that already has something developed. Okay? So if you're in an organization that already has a style developed, then you're simply working within that. If you're part of a new organization and you're developing this, then you have a lot more room in terms of creativity. One thing you can consider is using templates that are already part of different types of software programs. What you will think about then is, after we create this, we tend to want these to look somewhat similar between issues. So whether we design a couple of spread pages, that's when we're looking at the 2 pages open together, or we develop rules for what we will do in terms of what colors, use of imagery, use of logo, use of messaging, but just so we can have some consistency. So as we issue these, whether it's quarterly, monthly, I think for me personally, part of the fun of regardless that an employee or newsletter generation and generation of magazines pick it up and recognize is that these end up being really attractive documents. Right? So these end up being attractive promotional pieces, whether we're using them to thank and engage our employees internally, or we're using them externally to maintain or generate new customers, right? Regardless, these are done to attract readers. So we want you to be very mindful about the imagery you're using. A lot of times, because we want it to look and feel like our organization, we're going to implement photos and illustrations of our corporate space, of our employees, of our customers, right? We can do testimonials, we can do a day in the life of pieces. I want you to be very thoughtful in terms of your headlines, thinking about what is going to attract our stakeholders, what's going to maintain their attention. Here, there tends to be a discussion about down style versus all capitalization for headlines. Down style tends to be preferred. Stylistically, the example that you see with that bullet, what we're seeing with down style is we're typically only going to capitalize proper nouns. Everything else is going to be lowercase. Research also shows us that down style is easier and quicker for readers to recognize and engage with. Your lead sentences. So this is your first sentence of the story right beneath your headline. In a lot of ways, we're taking what we learned in the press release for that first paragraph and trying to distill it within our first couple sentences of a story. So again, looking to answer our 5 W's and our H, or who, what, where, when, why, and how. Again, it doesn't mean we're shoving all of these into the first sentence, but in those first couple sentences, so we can immediately let readers know the gist of the story. And again, I keep going back to the point, but we always want to emphasize for the reader what's in it for them. So our online newsletters, again, these can be done in tandem with the newsletter. It can be a supplemental piece. So I've seen a number of organizations who will just do a short one piece of 8.5 by 11 paper, double-sided, and saying that for more information about this story, or to get more information, or to sign up for this event, then go visit us online, and they will create a supplemental e-zine. So you can do this with an electronic magazine or a newsletter, an e-newsletter. But what I want to impress upon you is that if we're doing this electronically, we're not just simply slapping up a PDF of our newsletter or magazine in digital form. Certainly, if we want to make it available that way, we can, but you're missing out on a huge opportunity to further engage with your stakeholders, whether they are employees or existing or potential customers. You can embed hyperlinks, you can embed podcasts. If you have a YouTube channel and you have other ways to show the organization's expertise, put it there. It's a chance at the end of a story to do a small poll, right? To engage your readers further. Also, the way in which we write online is going to be more conversational. We're going to tend to use shorter sentences too to make it easier to read. We know a lot of times people are reading on their smartphones or on a tablet, so we have a small screen. We want to be mindful of that. We also want to be mindful that our attention span is unfortunately getting smaller and smaller. And one way in order to meet readers' needs is to use a more informal writing style online. So we just talked about newsletters, we talked about magazines. Now let's look at brochures. And these are things that I'm sure all of us have had a number of experiences with. But brochures tend to just be very basic and give background information about an organization, a product, or a service. So for the purposes, if you choose this week to create a brochure, I want you to think about this point. You can make it a general brochure about your organization. You can make it about a specific product they do, or you can do it about a service. All of those are legitimate options and a foci that you can focus on. What will help you decide? I want you to look at the goals and objectives that you set during your client research report. Right? So we decided that our clients needed to do X, Y, and Z. Think about meeting one of those needs in the brochure or the newsletter that you design. I also want you to think about the objective here. The same way we spent a lot of time thinking about the purpose of and the focus of a newsletter. We also say, who is going to read this brochure? Who is it directed to? Think about Western Michigan University. If we have a brochure that is directed to parents and answering their financial aid questions or safety questions, their concerns about the amount of time that their student will spend in earning a degree, that's going to look very different than a brochure that is purposely made for a high school senior or a student who's looking to transfer to Western, right? So figure out, what is the objective here? Who am I writing for? And then do the research and then think about what language do they expect and how do I answer their questions. So again, when you think about from their standpoint, what's in it for them, we're seeking to make a brochure that will make that abundantly clear for our audience members. Brochures also can tend to be expensive, so some things that I want you to think about, particularly paper. If we're making a brochure for a one-day event, then we can use a cheaper paper because we know it's not going to have a long life and it's not going to have repeated prints. But if we're making a promotional brochure for our organization to introduce ourselves, to position ourselves in response to competition, then that is something where we're going to probably select full color and a much thicker paper stock because, again, we want to have it as a strong introduction and reflection of who we are as an organization. General rule here, type fonts. What you want to do is, one, making sure that we're using fonts that look and feel like our organization. But in brochures and in newsletters too, because we have more creative freedom, sometimes there is a tendency to abuse it. I'm just going to say it, right? So we might think, oh, I'm not working within this template of the press release. I'm going to use this font and this font and this font. I'm going to use these clip art pieces. I'm going to use these different colors. Remembering that a lot of times, especially in design, less is more. I recommend that you're not using more than 3 different fonts, and this includes the font that in size that you're using for your headlines, for your subheads, and your body. So that's typically where we get that 3 font groups. So what size font are we using for our headline? Is it going to be bolded? Is it going to be bold and italicized so that we're consistent throughout the different panels? If we have subheads, we're using bullet points throughout. Again, thinking about what the design rules are there. And then finally, making sure that we're using the same type of font throughout the body. With brochures, again, same with newsletters, we're able to implement color. So figuring out what is going to enhance readers' ability to quickly process the information, to draw their eyes to certain aspects of your brochure, to make it, again, look and feel and reflect the organization in question. We're going to look at, so we focused on newsletters and brochures. We're going to look at annual reports, and we're going to talk about a couple other types of promotional writing. Annual reports, these end up being very time-consuming publications. Oftentimes, the audience is for financial stakeholders, right? So in the board of directors, individuals who stand to lose or gain based on the fiscal performance of your organization. Because of that, they tend to be, these annual reports, one, they're very technical. So if you are charged with working on an annual report, oftentimes you'll be working hand in hand with the organization's lawyers to make sure what we're disclosing is accurate and is information that we are required to by law. So we'd work with lawyers and then also with either the chief of finance or a lot of times a CPA, a certified public accountant, individuals who understand the finances, understand what this particular group of stakeholders is looking for and expecting from us.